Good morning, dear Intriguer, and welcome to Intrigue Outloud. On today's show, I'm joined by Intrigue co-founder John Fowler to discuss election results in Poland, Ecuador, New Zealand, and Australia. It's all coming up. Hey there, John. How are you?
Very good, Ethan. How are you? How was your weekend?
It was good. We were just talking beforehand about my newfound love of squash, and I take it you're a bit of a player as well.
Well, I'm not much of a player, but I enjoy it, and I bring a good spirit and attitude to it. Let's leave it at that.
That's all you need. That's all you need. Well, I'll tell you what. I also mentioned this before, but we have to cue in the listeners on this. My legs and glutes, John. My legs and my glutes.
I'm not offering any comment. You can say what you want, but I shall just nod politely.
You're welcome, listeners. So, John, the Ides of October, what a time for elections. We had general election voting on Sunday in Poland, Ecuador, New Zealand. There was a major referendum down under where you're from. Not to mention a big election in Liberia today on Tuesday.
Yeah, which might have been my favorite because being growing up in the 90s, it featured the footballing legend turned president, George Weah. Boy, he was a hell of a footballer when I was young.
Yeah. Oh, indeed. And John, I looked it up. This is a good one. So there have actually been a few heads of state who have played professional football, soccer. Get this, in 2014, Bolivian President Evo Morales signed a contract with a top flight club while he was still president. They paid him $200 a year, and he became the oldest active professional soccer player in the world at the time.
And had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that he was president, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a great fact. It's a great fact.
It's a real good one. So let's get back to the news. So the last time we spoke about something other than Israel and Gaza, we were chatting about the Slovakian election and that country's Eurosceptical, even Ukraine skeptical turn. Was the same thing at stake in Poland's election this weekend?
Yeah, it's tempting to kind of draw that analogy. And I think it's right as far as Euroscepticism goes. I think that was on the ballot on the weekend. But I think Ukraine skepticism is probably a little bit more complex, a little bit of it, but not as much as Slovakia. I think Polish politics have mostly kind of coalesced around a support for Ukraine. Certainly they were, a huge supporter early in the war. I think probably stemming from the fact that just there's a lot of historical fear of Russia and Russia's designs on that part of the world. But I think you are starting to see some signs of Polish frustration with Ukraine. There is at the moment, an ongoing dispute over Ukrainian grain. Polish farmers say that's making them less competitive.
Right.
We talked about during the UN week, Ethan, we talked about the remarks about from the Polish president where he said, Ukraine's like a drowning person. They'll tow you down under or tow them under with you or something like that. So that's a pretty incendiary statement. And then I think Poland also suspended transferring arms to Ukraine. So there was this kind of brewing potential for there to be problems. But I think we mentioned it a few weeks ago as well. I thought at the time it was probably political posturing in the lead up to this election that just happened over the weekend. Kind of an attempt by the ruling Law and Justice Party, who are super right wing, to show their voters that, hey, we're tough and we can hold people accountable, that kind of stuff.
Right. We'll stick by Ukraine, but we're not beholden to them.
Exactly.
So did that gambit work? I mean, how did the election turn out?
Well, no is the short answer. We won't have final results until Tuesday. It's important to note there is a whole complex way that the polls calculate the votes, which we are not going to go into, mostly because I don't understand it. But it looks like the Law and Justice Party won the battle, so to speak, because they won more votes technically than any other single party. But the opposition parties who've kind of come together in a block will win the war, to use the analogy, because they're projected to win around 250 of the 460 seats in the Polish parliament, which is obviously more than enough to form a government, but it's almost more importantly, it's enough to block the Law and Justice Party from forming a government, because as I understand it, they will get the first opportunity to try and form a government, and then the opposition will now be able to block them.
Yeah.
So that's the result.
And this could take 2 months before the opposition gets the chance. So
right,
there's a lot to play out here.
Yeah, there was that quote from a Polish politician who said, hopefully we'll have a government by Christmas or something like that. So we're in for a ride there. But I think more broadly, even this is like a really kind of, I don't want to say shocking, but like a stunning result, right? Like Law and Justice Party has been in power in Poland since 2015. I don't know that they were favourites, but when a government's been in power for that long, you always kind of back them to stay in power for a little bit longer. But perhaps even more interesting, I think, is that the voter turnout in Poland was 74%, which is by far the highest since Poland returned to democracy in 1989. I think that's a pretty good sign generally for the health of its democracy. So, I think if the opposition is able to form government, as we say, it will almost certainly be led by the Civic Platform Party of Donald Tusk, who some listeners may remember was the European Council president from 2014 to 2019, but he was also a former prime minister of Poland before that, from 2007 to 2014. So he's got a bit of experience in that role.
So former president of the European Council, this sounds like very good news for Europe.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is good news. Contrary to its name, the ruling Law and Justice Party has not been good for law and justice in Poland. I think it's fair to say they've rolled back press freedoms, and some say human rights, and they've helped Hungary's also fairly right-wing illiberal leader Viktor Orban stay out of trouble with the EU. So they've kind of been a bit of a thorn in the EU's side. I think Tusk will help bring Poland back into more mainstream European traditional values. But I think also I'm not 100% sure that those differences explain what we saw on Sunday. Put another way, I'm not sure that the European question was like the main driving force in the Polish election. I have this sense, I don't know how you feel, but just like incumbents seem to be getting beat everywhere. Classically, you would turn to look at economic indicators for that. Inflation's way up across, a lot of the world. There's obviously the war in Ukraine right next to Poland. That's been very disruptive for Europeans. So I think it's interesting to say that when things are uncertain, perhaps you want to chuck out the folks who are in charge because it's not working and replace them with someone new. So I think this outcome is significant. I'm not sure how much we can say that it's Polish people loving Europe more than just an interesting change with many, 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 many reasons. Law
and Justice Party, not good for law and justice. Next, you're going to tell me that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is none of the above. And I know you won't do that because I trust you too much.
I'll let you live in your hyper-literal world for a little longer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We could spend the rest of the episode talking about Poland, but there are so many more elections to discuss. So what happened in Ecuador? 5,000 miles away.
5,000 miles away, yeah. Well, this race was between Luisa Gonzalez, who is from the leftist Citizen Revolution movement, sounds leftist, and Daniel Noboa, who's a 35-year-old businessman. The next presidential election was actually scheduled for 2025, so 2 years from now, but it moved up after the former president Guillermo Lasso dissolved Congress earlier this year, in May this year. I think Ecuador's politics, like a bunch of South American countries, they've been dominated by sort of left of center candidates for much of the last few decades. And Lasso is actually the first conservative president since the early 2000s in Ecuador. But we're starting to see that the political alignment is shifting on the continent and in Ecuador as well, as they deal with an unprecedented crime crisis. So on Sunday, Ecuadorians chose the 35-year-old businessman Daniel Noboa by a margin of about 52 to 48. So close, but not super close.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about Ecuador's crime crisis, so our listeners will know about that. But what should we know about Mr. Noboa?
Yeah, well, I called him a businessman. He's actually the son of Alvaro Noboa, who is the richest man in Ecuador. And interestingly, I love this fact, he owns a massive banana conglomerate. So he made his money selling bananas, which is kind of nice. But he unsuccessfully ran his dad unsuccessfully ran for president 5 times between 1998 and 2013. So, there was some experience in the family of running for president. And Noboa Jr., the son, not actually called Jr., I should point out. But the younger Noboa campaigned on a tough on-crime platform, including an interesting pledge to send the country's worst criminals to prison ships off the coast, which gets headlines. His opponent, the leftist, on the other hand, she kind of promised to bolster Ecuador's social safety net, to tackle poverty, as a root cause of these kinds of issues.
Right.
And I think that to a lot of our listeners and to many people sounds like a pretty good idea, right? But a lot of voters, I think, in Latin America are kind of getting fed up with these policies that promise to solve the underlying cause of crime and violence, but hasn't seemed to work. And they are, again, I'm generalizing a little bit, but they're kind of moving towards leaders that promise to wage war on gangs and restore, order. I also think in this case, voters were probably drawn to Noboa because he's talked a lot about the economy. He's smart, he's Western educated, he's vibrant, he's new blood. He's 35, as I mentioned.
Even if his dad is a 5-time presidential candidate who's the wealthiest man in the country. But I see your point.
I guess he did a pretty good job of convincing people that he's not his dad. But yeah, I think he is seen as new blood in the country. For your point notwithstanding, but I think the only problem with new blood, obviously, is that Ecuador has huge problems, and new blood is also technically inexperienced, so he's got a lot to prove between now and May 2025, that he's the right guy to solve them.
Today's episode is sponsored by Patent Drop. If you love international intrigue, you'll love Patent Drop. It's a twice-weekly tech briefing that will keep you on the front lines of innovation. Patent Drop's team of investigative journalists scour the U.S. patent and trademark website to uncover the revolutionary ideas that indicate the direction big tech companies are taking our future. Check out the show notes to learn more. All right, welcome back. So it's almost time to go down under, John. But before we do, we've got to stop off in New Zealand, which held its general election this weekend too.
They did. New Zealand, the arch enemy. No, I'm obviously kidding. the land of beautiful mountains and great rugby and Lord of the Rings, I guess you might know them from. And
yeah,
obviously until very recently, one probably I think maybe the most famous prime minister in the world, arguably, maybe Jacinda Ardern. Certainly the most famous female leader in the world, I think. She was kind of a leader, I think you might call, of the aspirational kind of empathetic left. She was very, 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 very good at communication, I think is it's fair to say. And she led New Zealand, through a couple of crises. Obviously, we had the COVID pandemic, which I think a lot of people think New Zealand did really well through that period. New Zealand was, came out of that pretty unscathed, but she didn't get as good marks, I think, for her economic management over her prime ministership. And then in January, she stepped down. I think pretty unexpectedly, she kind of made an announcement and said she was resigning, and she passed the reins of her Labour Party to a longtime MP and ally named Chris Hipkins. Now, cynics, Ethan, would say that she jumped ship right before she knew she was about to lose an election. Because, and I'm going to let you guess this one.
Yeah, I think it's because New Zealand, like Poland and Ecuador, elected some new blood. It's opposition.
Exactly right. We have this theme running of incumbents getting handed their marching orders. And I guess the incumbency advantage does seem to be a thing of the past. The new blood here won't win.
I'm not sweating, John. I'm not sweating thinking about 2024.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an optical illusion.
Let's leave that one there, I think. Less said about that, the better for our blood pressure. In this case, though, the new blood in New Zealand won't win by much. I think it was a pretty tight election in the end, but it seems that the Conservative National Party, led by a guy called Christopher Luxon, will be able to form a coalition in Parliament with another Conservative party in New Zealand. And I think what's interesting here is to give you a sense of how much Labor's support collapsed in this election. They won 50% of the overall vote in 2020. But they won just 27% of the vote this time around. That's a precipitous drop. It's pretty clear that voters were ready for a change.
Yeah. So what do we know about Christopher Luxon?
Well, I'll be honest, I didn't know anything about him because he's a relative newcomer. He only entered politics in 2020. So the last parliamentary elections, he got elected, and he pretty quickly rose to the ranks to lead the National Party in 2021. And now, obviously, he's going to be the next Prime Minister of New Zealand. He was a bit of a known entity to New Zealanders, I'm told, because he was the former CEO of Air New Zealand, which is the country's flag-carrying airline. And it must be a pretty good airline too. I've not flown it in a long time, but it must be pretty good because I'm not sure that any other country, particularly not the US, Ethan, we wouldn't be in a rush to elect the CEO of American Airlines if my most recent experience is on AA or anything to go by. I think the opposite. We'd send them to jail. But Luxon ran on a pretty classic conservative platform of lower taxes, fighting crime. He interestingly said, and again, I'm not an expert on this issue, but he was talking a lot about reforming the country's healthcare network, particularly for the indigenous Maori population in New Zealand, because he says that creates a two-tiered society between, non-indigenous and indigenous Maoris. So I think that's interesting. But I think we'll have to wait and see how he governs. And most importantly, I think whether he can kind of bring down New Zealand's 6.7% inflation rate. Yeah. That probably won him a lot of votes, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's fun to kick out the old guard, but, you're expecting the new guard to make changes. These are not easy problems to solve. John, that last bit about the Maori actually is a perfect transition for our next and last country, Australia, which held a referendum on The Voice this weekend. First of all, what is The Voice?
Yeah, well, I know what you want me to say here, because I feel like someone on our team, I'll pretend it wasn't you. Is that a singing show? I was like, I'm here to tell you it's not the singing show. Same name, different thing. The Voice actually was a very important proposed change to Australia's constitution that would have recognised the sovereignty of, and I'm going to say our, because I'm Australian, but our First Nations people, by essentially creating, and again, it's pretty technical, but creating an advisory body to the Australian Parliament, which would advise lawmakers, parliamentarians, on how proposed laws would affect, Indigenous interests. So really kind of putting Indigenous issues into the minds of lawmakers as they're going through the process of governing Australia. The proposal is I think it's a couple of years old now, but it hadn't been brought forward for a referendum by previous governments because they were conservative and they didn't want to bring this issue forward. That changed when Anthony Albanese became Prime Minister in 2022. He's from Labor, the left-wing party in Australia, and he endorsed The Voice and scheduled the referendum to have a vote on the issue, and that happened on the weekend. After months of campaigning, and I think it was a couple of months in the end of campaigning, The Voice was really comprehensively rejected by, I think, a nationwide margin of around 21 points. And again, very quick digression, to pass a change to the constitution in Australia, you need to have a majority of individual states vote for the amendment, and also a majority of people across the country to vote for the amendment. And it didn't pass in a single state. It didn't win a single state, and it lost the national vote by a significant margin. So it was a rout. It wasn't close.
Not a single state. I mean, that's a huge loss for supporters of The Voice, but it's also a huge loss for Albanese, who became the spokesperson, a big advocate for this cause. Is he in trouble? Could this spell trouble for his government?
I think you're right. I think by tying himself to this issue and then being so roundly defeated, the kind of conventional wisdom would be that is a damaging political blow. And It may well be.
A referendum on him.
Yeah, right. And I think that's probably fair. My gut still says it's probably not going to be. He's got support within his own party. He's relatively newly elected. The previous government was in power for such a long time that I think it's probably a little bit early to kind of say that he's on the ropes or anything like that. But I think it'll certainly, affect his popularity and what he's able to achieve. I think if I might step back for a second, what I find interesting about this is that over the last few years, over the kind of campaigning period, public polling kind of showed a ton of support for The Voice. This was like a relatively popular idea. In fact, I think as recently as last December, over 60% of Australians said they'd vote in favour of The Voice. But, I think what we saw happen over the weekend was in large part driven by what we kind of see elsewhere. People are concerned about other issues. And, it's not that they can't do multiple things at once, but I think that they're not paying the kind of attention that a constitutional referendum requires people to really be up in arms and really care about this thing. And I think this is was maybe seen as a little bit of a sideshow.
Right. I mean, there was some slogan. There was a slogan that said from the no side, if you don't understand it, vote no.
Yes.
This was just sort of a convoluted, confusing issue for a lot of voters.
I think they were pretty successful in making that argument. I think, again, those on the ground in Australia, and obviously I'm not there, they might have a little bit more to say about the tactics of the no side. I think there's widespread claims of misinformation, sordid tactics, that kind of stuff. But I think ultimately, again, being an Australian, I think we're just fairly resistant to change. In my lifetime, we've rejected one referendum before about becoming getting rid of the British monarchy. That was defeated as well. So I think we're just like not boat rockers. We're kind of, if it ain't broke, why should we fix it? And of course, again, without going into the details of Indigenous issues in Australia, most Australians have no idea of the challenges that are facing Australia's Indigenous population. And for those who do have an idea, I think they would say that the situation is very much broken and very much needs fixing. But again, Indigenous Australians make up about 4% of the overall population. So these aren't issues, as you rightly say, that touch many non-Indigenous Australians' lives in a way that they're really going to sit down and engage and get exercised about. Vis-a-vis, maybe the economy is something that is far more in people's minds. So unfortunately, sometimes it is as simple as that. And I guess there's not much more to say about it than that.
Well, John, a tour de force, 4 countries. We traveled the world together, and it was a pleasure.
Let's say we do it again soon.
And that's going to do it for me. By the way, we're still tracking the events unfolding in Israel this past week. Be sure to check out the International Intrigue newsletter for all the latest updates. In the meantime, I'm Ethan Plotkin. See you on Friday.